Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Chapters Live. As always, I'm Caitlin from the Fletcher branch. As always, I have on my fabulous squid hat, and I hope you are also wearing your hats of fantastic marine animals because we are once more delving into the underwater world of Jules Verne's adventure classic, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Now, when we left off, we were finally introduced to kind of the mysterious figure in our whole story, that of Captain Nemo, who pilots his underwater craft, the Nautilus. Now, Captain Nemo apparently has, as we learned from Professor Aronnax and Ned Land and Conseil after they were captured, they are now on board this underwater craft, which has been outfitted with everything: a library, specimens from everywhere under the sea, all sorts of treasures, and that Captain Nemo has decided to live. He's given up the surface world. He has decided to live completely under the sea. He has completely cut himself off from the land and chooses to be a part of the sea. Everything he has comes from the sea, and the ship is powered by means of electricity. It is a fantastic ship. And Professor Aronnax and Ned and Conseil, they're not really prisoners. They can go wherever they want on the ship, but ship's where they live now. So we are once again diving into the book, and we're going to dive back into the adventures of these three now consigned to be underwater dwellers with Chapter 14, The Black Current. The part of the planet Earth that the seas occupy has been assessed at 3,832,558 square myriameters, hence more than 38 billion hectares. This liquid mass totals 2,250,000,000 cubic miles and can form a sphere with a diameter of 60 leagues, whose weight would be 3 quintillion metric tons. To appreciate such a number, we should remember that a quintillion is to a billion what a billion is to one. In other words, there are as many billions in a quintillion as ones in a billion. Now then, this liquid mass nearly equals the total amount of water that has poured through all the Earth's rivers for the past 40,000 years. During prehistoric times, an era of fire was followed by an era of water. First, there was ocean everywhere. Then, during the Silurian period, the tops of mountains gradually appeared above the waves. Islands emerged, disappeared beneath temporary floods, rose again, were fused to form continents, and finally, the Earth's geography settled into what we have today. Solid matter had wrested from liquid matter some 37,657,000 square miles, hence 12,916,000,000 hectares. The outlines of the continents allow the seas to be divided into 5 major parts: the frozen Arctic and Antarctic Oceans, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean extends north to south between the two polar circles and east to west between America and Asia over an expanse of 145 degrees of longitude. It's the most tranquil of the seas. Its currents are wide and slow-moving, its tides moderate, its rainfall abundant. And this was the ocean that I was first destined to cross under these strangest of auspices. "If you don't mind, Professor," Captain Nemo told me, "we'll determine our exact position and fix the starting point of our voyage. It's 15 minutes before noon. I'm going to rise to the surface of the water." The captain pressed an electric bell 3 times. The pumps began to expel water from the ballast tanks. On the pressure gauge, a needle marked the decreasing pressures that indicated the Nautilus's upward progress. Then the needle stopped. "Here we are," the captain said. I made my way to the central companionway, which led to the platform. I climbed its metal steps, passed through the open hatches, and arrived topside on the Nautilus. The platform emerged only 80 centimeters above the waves. The Nautilus's bow and stern boasted that spindle-shaped outline that had caused the ship to be compared appropriately to a long cigar. I noted the slight overlap of its sheet iron plates, which resembled the scales covering the bodies of our big land reptiles. So I had a perfectly natural explanation for why, despite the best spyglass, this boat had always been mistaken for a marine animal. Near the middle of the platform, the skiff was half set in the ship's hull, making a slight bulge. Fore and aft stood 2 cupolas of moderate height. their sides slanting and partly inset with heavy biconvex glass, one reserved for the helmsman steering the Nautilus, the other for the brilliance of the powerful electric beacon lighting his way. The sea was magnificent, the skies clear. This long aquatic vehicle could barely feel the broad undulations of the ocean. A mild breeze out of the east rippled the surface of the water. Free of all mist, the horizon was ideal for taking sights. There was nothing to be seen, not a reef, not an islet, no more Abraham Lincoln, a deserted immenseness. Raising his sextant, Captain Nemo took the altitude of the sun, which would give him his latitude. He waited for a few minutes until the orb touched the rim of the horizon. While he was taking his sights, he didn't move a muscle, and the instrument couldn't have been steadier in hands made out of marble. "Noon," he said. "Professor, whenever you're ready." I took one last look at the sea, a little yellowish near the landing places of Japan, and I went below again to the main lounge. There the captain fixed his position and used a chronometer to calculate his longitude, which he double-checked against his previous observation of hour angles. Then he told me, "Professor Aronnax, we're in longitude 137 degrees 15 west." "West of which meridian?" I asked quickly, hoping the captain's reply might give me a clue to his nationality. "Sir," he answered me, "I have chronometers variously set to the meridians of Paris, Greenwich, and Washington, D.C., but in your honor, I'll use the one for Paris." This reply told me nothing. I bowed, and the commander went on. "We're in longitude 137 degrees 15 west of the meridian of Paris, and longitude 30 degrees 7 north, in other words, about 300 miles from the shores of Japan. At noon on this day of November 8th, we hereby begin our voyage of exploration under the waters." "May God be with us," I replied. "And now, Professor," the captain added, "I'll leave you to your intellectual pursuits. I've set our course east-northeast at a depth of 50 meters. Here are some large-scale charts on which you'll be able to follow that course. The lounge is at your disposal, and with your permission, I'll take my leave." Captain Nemo bowed. I was left to myself, lost in my thoughts. They all centered on the Nautilus's commander. Would I ever learn the nationality of this eccentric man who had boasted of having none? His sworn hate for humanity, a hate that perhaps was bent on some dreadful revenge. What had provoked it? Was he one of those unappreciated scholars, one of those geniuses embittered by the world, as Conseil expressed it, a latter-day Galileo, or maybe one of those men of science, like America's Commander Maury, whose careers were ruined by political revolutions? I couldn't say yet. As for me, whom fate had just brought aboard his vessel, whose life he had held in the balance, he had received me coolly but hospitably. Only he never took the hand I extended to him. He never extended his own. For an entire hour I was deep in these musings, trying to probe this mystery that fascinated me so. Then my eyes focused on a huge world map displayed on the table, and I put my finger on the very spot where I just determined longitude and latitude intersected. Like the continents, the sea has its rivers. These are exclusive currents that can be identified by their temperature and color, the most remarkable being the one called the Gulf Stream. Science has defined the global paths of 5 chief currents, one in the North Atlantic, a second in the South Atlantic, a third in the North Pacific, a fourth in the South Pacific, and a fifth in the Southern Indian Ocean. Also, it's likely that a 6th current used to exist in the Northern Indian Ocean, when the Caspian and Aral Seas joined up with certain large Asian lakes to form a single uniform expanse of water. Now then, at the spot indicated on the world map, one of these sea-going rivers was rolling by, the Kuroshio of the Japanese, the Black Current. Heated by perpendicular rays from the tropical sun, it leaves the Bay of Bengal, crosses the Strait of Malacca, goes up the shores of Asia, and curves into the North Pacific as far as the Aleutian Islands, carrying along trunks of camphor trees and other local items, the pure indigo of its warm waters sharply contrasting with the ocean's waves. It was this current the Nautilus was about to cross. I watched it on the map with my eyes. I saw it lose itself in the immenseness of the Pacific, and I felt myself swept along with it, when Ned Land and Conseil appeared in the lounge doorway. My 2 gallant companions stood petrified at the sight of the wonders on display. "Where are we?" the Canadian exclaimed. "In the Quebec Museum?" "Begging master's pardon," Conseil answered, "but this seems more like The Sommerad Artifacts Exhibition? My friends, I replied, signaling them to enter. You're neither Canada nor France, but securely aboard the Nautilus, 50 meters below sea level. If master says so, then so be it, Conseil answered. But in all honesty, this lounge is enough to astonish even someone Flemish like myself. Indulge your astonishment, my friend, and have a look, because there's plenty of work here for a classifier of your talents. Conseil needed no encouraging. Bending over the glass cases, the gallant lad was already muttering choice words from the naturalist vocabulary: class Gastropoda, family Bucceanodea, genus Cowrie, species Cyprea, Madagascar, Renaissance, etc. Meanwhile, Ned Land, less dedicated to conchology, questioned me about my interview with Captain Nemo. Had I discovered who he was, where he came from, where he was heading, how deep is he taking us? In short, 1,000 questions I had no time to answer. I told him everything I knew, or rather everything I didn't know, and I asked him what he had seen or heard on his part. Haven't seen or heard a thing, the Canadian replied. I haven't even spotted the crew of this boat. By any chance, could they be electric too? Electric? Oh, ye gods, I'm half tempted to believe it. But back to you, Professor Aronnax, Ned Land said, still hanging on to his ideas. Can't you tell me how many men are on board? 10, 20, 50, 100? I'm unable to answer you, Mr. Land, and trust me on this, for the time being, get rid of these notions of taking over the Nautilus or escaping from it. This boat is a masterpiece of modern technology, and I'd be sorry to have missed it. Many people would welcome the circumstances that have been handed us just to walk in the midst of these wonders. So keep calm, and let's see what's happening around us. See, the harpooner exclaimed, there's nothing to see, nothing we'll ever see from this sheet iron prison. We're simply running around blindfolded. Ned Land was just pronouncing these last words when we were suddenly plunged into darkness, utter darkness. The ceiling lights went out so quickly my eyes literally ached, as if we had just experienced the opposite sensation of going from the deepest gloom to the brightest sunlight. We stood stock still, not knowing what surprise was waiting for us, whether pleasant or unpleasant. But a sliding sound became audible. You could tell that some panels were shifting over the Nautilus's sides. It's the beginning of the end, Ned Land said. Oder Hydromedusa? Conseil muttered. Suddenly, through two oblong openings, daylight appeared on both sides of the lounge. The liquid masses came into view, brightly lit by the ship's electric outpourings. We are separated from the sea by two panes of glass. Initially, I shuddered at the thought that these fragile partitions could break, but strong copper bands secured them, giving them nearly infinite resistance. The sea was clearly visible for a 1-mile radius around the Nautilus. What a sight! What pen could describe it? Who could portray the effects of this light through these translucent sheets of water, the subtlety of its progressive shadings into the ocean's upper and lower strata? The transparency of salt water has long been recognized. Its clarity is believed to exceed that of spring water. The mineral and organic substances it holds in suspension actually increase its translucency. In certain parts of the Caribbean Sea, you can see the sandy bottom with startling distinctness, as deep as 145 meters down, and the penetrating power of the sun's rays seem to give out only at a depth of 300 meters. But in this fluid setting traveled by the Nautilus, our electric glow was being generated in the very heart of the waves. It was no longer illuminated water, it was liquid light. If we accept the hypotheses of the microbiologist Ehrenberg, who believes that these underwater depths are lit up by phosphorescent organism, nature has certainly saved one of her most prodigious sights for residents of the sea, and I could judge for myself from the thousand-fold play of the light. On both sides I had windows opening over these unexplored depths. The darkness in the lounge enhanced the brightness outside, and we stared as if this clear glass were the window of an immense aquarium. The Nautilus seemed to be standing still. This was due to the lack of landmarks, but streaks of water parted by the ship's spur sometimes threaded before our eyes with extraordinary speed. In wonderment, we leaned on our elbows before these show windows, and our stunned silence remained unbroken until Conseil said, "You wanted to see something, Ned, my friend? Well, now you have something to see." "How unusual," the Canadian put it, putting aside his tantrums and getaway schemes while submitting to this irresistible allure. A man would go an even greater distance just to stare at such a sight. Ah, I exclaimed, I see our captain's way of life. He's found himself a separate world that saves its most astonishing wonders just for him. But where are the fish? The Canadian ventured to observe. I don't see any fish. Why would you care, Ned, my friend? Conseil replied, since you have no knowledge of them. Me? A fisherman? Ned Land exclaimed. And on this subject a dispute arose between the two friends, since both were knowledgeable about fish, but from totally different standpoints. Everyone knows that fish make up the fourth and last class in the vertebrate branch. They have been quite aptly defined as, quote, cold-blooded vertebrates with a double circulatory system, breathing through gills and designed to live in water. They consist of two distinct species, the series of bony fish, in other words, those whose spines have vertebrae made of bone, and cartilaginous fish, in other words, those whose spines have vertebrae made of cartilage. Possibly the Canadian was familiar with this distinction, but Conseil knew far more about it, and since he and Ned were now fast friends, he just had to show off. So he told the harpooner, Ned, my friend, you are a slayer of fish, a highly skilled fisherman. You've caught a large number of these fascinating animals, but I'll bet you don't know how they're classified. Sure I do, the harpooner replied in all seriousness. They're classified into fish we eat and fish we don't eat. Spoken like a true glutton, Conseil replied. But tell me, are you familiar with the differences between bony fish and cartilaginous fish? Just maybe, Conseil. And how about the subdivisions of these two large classes? I haven't the foggiest notion, the Canadian replied. All right, listen and learn then, my friend. Bony fish are subdivided into 6 orders. Primo, the Encanthopterygians, whose upper jaw is fully formed and free-moving, and whose gills take the shape of a comb. This order consists of 15 families, in other words, 3/4 of all known fish. Example, the common perch. Pretty fair eating, Ned Land replied. Secundo, Conseil went on, the abdominals, whose pelvic fins attach under the abdomen to the rear of the pectorals, but aren't attached to the shoulder bone, an order that's divided into 5 families and makes up the great majority of freshwater fish. Examples, carp, pike. Ugh, the Canadian put in with distinct scorn. You could keep the freshwater fish. Tertio, Conseil said. The subbrachians, whose pelvic fins are attached under the pectorals and hang directly from the shoulder bone. This order contains 4 families. Examples, flatfish such as sole, turbot, dab, plaice, brill, etc. Excellent, really excellent, the harpooner exclaimed, interested in fish only from an edible viewpoint. Quarto, Conseil went on, unabashed, the airpods, with long bodies that lack pelvic fins and are covered by a heavy, often glutinous skin, in order consisting of only 1 family. Examples, common eels and electric eels. So, just so, Ned Land replied. Quinto, Conseil said, the Lophobrachians, which have fully formed, free-moving jaws, but whose gills consist of little tufts arranged in pairs along their gill arches. This order includes only 1 family. Examples, seahorses and dragonfish. Bad, very bad, the harpooner replied. Sexto and last, Conseil said, the plectognaths, whose maxillary bone is firmly attached to the side of the intermaxillary that forms the jaw, and whose palate arch is locked to the skull by sutures that render the jaw immovable, an order lacking true pelvic fins and which consists of 2 families. Examples, puffers and moonfish. They're an insult to a frying pan, the Canadian exclaimed. Are you grasping all this, Ned, my friend? Asked the scholarly Conseil. Not a lick of it, Conseil, my friend, the harpooner replied, but keep going because you fill me with fascination. As for cartilaginous fish, Conseil went on, unflappably, they consist of only 3 orders. Good news, Ned put in. Primo, the cyclostomes, whose jaws are fused into a flexible ring and whose gill openings are simply a large number of holes, an order consisting of only 1 family. Example, the lamprey. In acquired taste, Ned Land replied. Secundo, the salacians, with gills resembling those of the cyclostomes, but whose lower jaw is free-moving. This order, which is the most important in the class, consists of 2 families. Example, the ray and the shark. What? Ned Land exclaimed. Rays and man-eaters in the same order. Well, Conseil, my friend, on behalf of the rays, I would advise you to put them in the same fish tank. Tertio, Conseil replied. The Sturionians, whose gill opening is the usual single slit adorned with a gill cover, an order consisting of 4 genera. Example, the sturgeon. Ah, Conseil, my friend, you saved the best for last, in my opinion, anyhow. And that's all of them. Yes, my gallant Ned, Conseil replied. And note well, even when one has grasped all this, one still knows next to nothing because these families are subdivided into genera, subgenera, species, varieties. All right, Conseil, my friend, the harpooner said, leaning toward the glass panel. Here come a couple of your varieties now. Yes, fish, Conseil exclaimed. One would think he was in front of an aquarium. No, I replied, because an aquarium is nothing more than a cage, and these fish are as free as birds in the air. Well, Conseil, my friend, identify them. Start naming them, Ned Land exclaimed. Me? Conseil replied. I'm unable to. That's my employer's bailiwick. And in truth, although the fine lad was a classifying maniac, he was no naturalist, and I doubt that he could tell a bonito from a tuna. In short, he was the exact opposite of the Canadian, who knew nothing about classification, but he could instantly put a name to any fish. A triggerfish, I said. It's a Chinese triggerfish, Ned Land replied. Genus Balistes, family Scleroderma, order Plectonatha, Conseil muttered. Assuredly, Ned and Conseil in combination added up to one outstanding naturalist. The Canadian was not mistaken. Cavorting around the Nautilus was a school of triggerfish with flat bodies, grainy skins, armed with stings on their dorsal fins, and with 4 prickly rows of quills quivering on both sides of their tails. Nothing could have been more wonderful than the skin covering them, white underneath, gray above, with spots of gold sparkling in the dark eddies of the waves. Around them, rays were undulating like sheets flapping in the wind, and among these I spotted, much to my glee, a Chinese ray, yellowish on its top side, a dainty pink on its belly, and armed with 3 stings behind its eyes, a rare species whose very existence was still doubted in Les Pedes day, since that pioneering classifier of fish had seen one only in a portfolio of Japanese drawings. For 2 hours, a whole aquatic army escorted the Nautilus. In the midst of their leaping and cavorting, while they competed with each other in beauty, radiance, and speed, I could distinguish some green wrasse, bewhiskered mullet marked with pairs of black lines, white gobies from the genus Eleotris, with curved caudal fins and violet spots on the back, wonderful Japanese mackerel from the genus Scomber, with blue bodies and silver heads, glittering azure goldfish whose name by itself gives their full description, several varieties of porgy or gilthead, some banded gilthead with fins variously blue and yellow, some with horizontal heraldic bars, and enhanced by a black strip around their caudal area, some with color zones and elegantly corseted in their 6 waistbands. Trumpetfish with flute-like beaks that looked like genuine seafaring woodcocks, and were sometimes a meter long. Japanese salamanders, serpentine moray eels from the genus Echna, that were 6 feet long with sharp little eyes and a huge mouth bristling with teeth, etc. Our wonderment stayed at an old-time fever pitch. Our exclamations were endless. Ned identified the fish, Conseil classified them, and as for me, I was in ecstasy over the verve of their movements and the beauty of their forms. Never before had I been given the chance to glimpse these animals alive and at large in their native element. Given such a complete collection from the seas of Japan and China, I won't mention every variety that passed before our dazzled eyes. More numerous than birds in the air, these fish raced right up to us, no doubt attracted by the brilliant glow of our electric beacon. Suddenly daylight appeared in the lounge. The sheet iron panels slid shut. The magical vision disappeared. But for a good while I kept dreaming away, until the moment my eyes focused on the instruments hanging on the wall. The compass still showed our heading as east-northeast. The pressure gauge indicated a pressure of 5 atmospheres, corresponding to a depth of 50 meters, and the electric log gave our speed as 15 miles per hour. I waited for Captain Nemo, but he didn't appear. The clock marked the hour of 5. Ned Land and Conseil returned to their cabin. as for me, I repaired to my stateroom. There I found dinner ready for me. It consisted of turtle soup made from the daintiest hawksbill, a red mullet with white, slightly flaky flesh, whose liver, when separately prepared, makes delicious eating, plus a loin of imperial angelfish, whose flavor struck me as even better than salmon. I spent the evening in reading, writing, and thinking. Then drowsiness overtook me, I stretched out on my eelgrass mattress, and I fell into a deep slumber while the Nautilus glided through the swiftly flowing black current. Chapter 15. An Invitation in Writing. The next day, November 9th, I woke up only after a long 12-hour slumber. Conseil, a creature of habit, came to ask how Master's night went and to offer his services. He had left his Canadian friend sleeping like a man who had never done anything else. I let the gallant lad babble as he pleased without giving him much in the way of a reply. I was concerned about Captain Nemo's absence during our session the previous afternoon, and I hoped to see him again today. Soon I had put on my clothes, which were woven from strands of seashell tissue. More than once their composition provoked comment from Conseil. I informed him that they were made from the smooth silken filaments with which the fan mussel, a type of seashell quite abundant along Mediterranean beaches, attaches itself to rocks. In olden times, fine fabric, stockings, and gloves were made from such filaments because they are both very soft and very warm. So the Nautilus's crew could dress themselves at little cost without needing a thing from cotton growers, sheep, or silkworms on shore. As soon as I was dressed, I made my way to the main lounge. It was deserted. I dove into studying the conchological treasures enmeshed inside the glass cases. I also investigated the huge plant albums that were filled with the rarest marine herbs, all of which, although they were pressed and dried, still kept their wonderful colors. Among these valuable water plants, I noted various seaweed, some Cladostephus verticalilis, peacock's tails, fig leaf caulopa, grain-bearing beauty bushes, delicate rose-tangled tinted scarlet, sea colander arranged into fan shapes, mermaids' cups that look like the caps of squat mushrooms, and for years have been classified among the zoophytes. In short, a complete series of algae. The entire day passed without my being honored by a visit from Captain Nemo. The panels in the lounge didn't open. Perhaps they didn't want us to get tired of these beautiful things. The Nautilus kept to an east-northeasterly heading, a speed of 12 miles per hour, and a depth between 50 and 60 meters. Next day, November 10th, the same neglect, the same solitude. I didn't see a soul from the crew. Ned and Conseil spent the better part of the day with me. They were astonished at the captain's inexplicable absence. Was this eccentric man ill? Did he want to change his plans concerning us? But, after all, as Conseil noted, we enjoyed complete freedom, we were daintily and abundantly fed. Our host had kept to the terms of his agreement. We couldn't complain, and moreover, the very uniqueness of our situation had such generous rewards in store for us, we had no grounds for criticism. That day I started my diary of these adventures, which has enabled me to narrate them with the most scrupulous accuracy, and one odd tale, I wrote it on paper manufactured from marine eelgrass. Early in the morning on November 11th, fresh air poured through the Nautilus's interior, informing me that we had returned to the surface of the ocean to renew our oxygen supply. I headed for the central companionway and climbed onto the platform. It was 6 o'clock. I found the weather overcast, the sea gray but calm. Hardly a billow. I hoped to encounter Captain Nemo there. Would he come? I saw only the helmsman imprisoned in his glass-windowed pilot house. Seated on the ledge furnished by the hull of the skiff, I inhaled the sea's salty aroma with great pleasure. Little by little the mists were dispersed under the action of the sun's rays. The radiant orb cleared the eastern horizon. Under its gaze, the sea caught on fire like a trail of gunpowder. Scattered on high, the clouds were colored in bright, wonderfully shaded hues, and numerous lady fingers warned of day-long winds. But what were mere winds to this Nautilus, which no storms could intimidate? So I was marveling at this delightful sunrise, so life-giving and cheerful, when I heard someone climbing onto the platform. I was prepared to greet Captain Nemo, but it was his chief officer who appeared, whom I had already met during our first visit with the captain. He advanced over to the platform, not seeming to notice my presence. A powerful spyglass to his eye, he scrutinized every point of the horizon with the utmost care. Then, His examination over, he approached the hatch and pronounced a phrase whose exact wording follows below. I remember because every morning it was repeated under the same circumstances. It ran like this: Nontron, Resbach, Lorny, Virch. What it meant I was unable to say. These words pronounced, the chief officer went below again. I thought the Nautilus was about to resume its underwater navigating, so I went down the hatch and back through the gangways to my stateroom. 5 days passed this way with no change in our situation. Every morning I climbed onto the platform. The same phrase was pronounced by the same individual. Captain Nemo did not appear. I was pursuing the policy that we'd seen the last of him when, on November 16th, while re-entering my stateroom with Ned and Conseil, I found a note addressed to me on the table. I opened it impatiently. It was written in a script which was clear and neat, but a bit Old English in style, its characters reminding me of German calligraphy. The note was worded as follows: Captain Aronnax aboard the Nautilus, November 16th, 1867. Captain Nemo invites Professor Aronnax on a hunting trip that will take place tomorrow morning in his Crespo Island forests. He hopes nothing will prevent the professor from attending, and he looks forward with pleasure to the professor's companions joining him. Captain Nemo, commander of the Nautilus. A hunting trip, Ned exclaimed, and in his forests on Crespo Island. Conseil added, but does this mean the old boy goes ashore? Ned went on. That seems to be the gist of it. Well, we've got to accept, the Canadian answered. Once we're on solid ground, we'll figure out a course of action. Besides, it wouldn't pay me to eat a couple slices of fresh venison. Without trying to reconcile the contradictions between Captain Nemo's professed horror of continents or islands and his invitation to go hunting in a forest, I was content to reply, first let's look into this Crespo Island. I consulted the world map, and in latitude 32 degrees 40 north and longitude 167 degrees 50 west, I found an islet that had been discovered in 1801 by Captain Crespo, which old Spanish charts called Roco de la Plata. In other words, Silver Rock. So we were about 1,800 miles from our starting point, and by a slight change of heading, the Nautilus was bringing us back toward the southeast. I showed my companions this small, stray rock in the middle of the North Pacific. If Captain Nemo does sometimes go ashore, I told them, at least he only picks desert islands. Ed Land shook his head without replying. Then he and Conseil left me. After supper was served me by the mute and emotionless steward, I fell asleep, but not without some anxieties. When I woke up the next day, November 17th, I sensed that the Nautilus was completely motionless. I dressed hurriedly and entered the main lounge. Captain Nemo was there waiting for me. He stood up, bowed, and asked if it suited me to come along. Since he made no allusion to his absence the past 8 days, I also refrained from mentioning it, and I simply answered that my companions and I were ready to go with him. Only, sir, I added, I'll take the liberty of addressing a question to you. Address away, Professor Aronnax, and if I'm able to answer, I will. Well then, Captain, how is it that you severed all ties with the shore, yet you own forests on Crespo Island? Professor, the captain answered me, these forests of mine don't bask in the heat and light of the sun. They aren't frequented by lions, tigers, panthers, or other quadrupeds. They're known only to me. They grow only for me. These forests aren't on land. They're actual underwater forests. Underwater forests, I exclaimed. Yes, Professor. And you're offering to take me to them? Precisely. On foot, without getting your feet wet. While hunting. Rifles in hand. Rifles in hand. I stared at the Nautilus's commander with an air anything but flattering to the man. Assuredly, I said to myself, he's contracted some mental illness. He's had a fit that's lasted 8 days and isn't even over yet. What a shame. I'd liked him better eccentric than insane. These thoughts were clearly readable on my face, but Captain Nemo remained content with inviting me to follow him, and I did so like a man resigned to the worst. We arrived at the dining room where we found breakfast served. Professor Aronnax, the captain told me, I beg you to share my breakfast without formality. We can chat while we eat, because although I promised you a stroll in my forest, I made no pledge to arrange for your encountering a restaurant there. Accordingly, eat your breakfast like a man who'll probably eat dinner only when it's extremely late. I did justice to this meal. It was made up of various fish and some slices of sea cucumber, that praiseworthy zoophyte, all garnished with some highly appetizing seaweed as the Porphyria lactinata and the Laurencia primafetta. Our beverage consisted of clear water to which, following the captain's example, I added some drops of a fermented liquor extracted by the Kamchatka process from the seaweed known by name as Rhodemia palmata. At first, Captain Nemo ate without pronouncing a single word. Then he told me, "Professor, when I proposed that you go hunting in my Crespo forests, you thought that I was contradicting myself. When I informed you that it was an issue of underwater forests, you thought I'd gone insane. Professor, you must never make snap judgments about your fellow man." "Oh, Captain, believe me, kindly listen to me, and you'll see if you have grounds for accusing me of insanity or self-contradiction." "I'm all attention." "Professor, you know as well as I do that a man can live underwater so long as he carries with him his own supply of breathable air. For underwater work projects, the workman wears a waterproof suit with his head imprisoned in a metal capsule, while he receives air from above by means of force pumps and flow regulators." "That's the standard equipment of a diving suit," I said. "Correct, but under such conditions the man has no freedom. He's attached to a pump that sends him air through an India rubber hose. It's an actual chain. It fetters him to the shore, and if we were bound in this way to the Nautilus, we couldn't go far either." "Then how do you break free?" I asked. "We use the Rouquayrol de Nehru's device, invented by two of your fellow countrymen, but refined by me for my own special uses, thereby enabling you to risk these new physiological conditions without suffering any organic disorders. It consists of a tank built from heavy sheet iron in which I store air under a pressure of 50 atmospheres. This tank is fastened to the back by means of straps, like a soldier's knapsack. Its top part forms a box where the air is regulated by a bellows mechanism and can be released only at its proper tension. In the Rouquayrol device that has been in general use, two India rubber hoses leave this box and feed to a kind of tent that imprisons the operator's nose and mouth. One hose is for the entrance of air to be inhaled, the other for the exit of air to be exhaled, and the tongue closes off the former or the latter depending on the breather's needs. But in my case, since I faced considerable pressures at the bottom of the sea, I needed to enclose my head in a copper sphere, like those found on standard diving suits, and the two hoses for inhalation and exhalation now feed to that sphere." "That's perfect, Captain Nemo, but the air you carried must be quickly depleted, and once it contains no more than 15% oxygen, it becomes unfit for breathing." "Surely. But as I told you, Professor Aronnax, the Nautilus's pumps enable me to store air under considerable pressure, and given this circumstance, the tank on my diving equipment can supply breathable air for 9 or 10 hours. I've no more objections to raise," I replied. "I only ask you, Captain, how can you light your way at the bottom of the ocean?" "With the Ruhmkorff device, Professor Aronnax. If the first is carried on the back, the second is fastened to the belt. It consists of a Bunsen battery that I activate not with potassium dichromate, but with sodium. An induction coil gathers the electricity generated and directs it to a specially designed lantern. In this lantern, one finds a glass spiral that contains only a residue of carbon dioxide gas. When the device is operating, this gas becomes luminous and gives off a continuous whitish light. Thus provided for, I breathe and I see." "Captain Nemo, to my every objection you give such crushing answers. I'm afraid to entertain a single doubt. However, though I have no choice but to accept both the Rouquayrol and Ruhmkorff devices, I'd like to register some reservations about the rifle with which you'll equip me." "But it isn't a rifle that uses gunpowder," the captain replied. "Oh, then it's an air gun." "Surely. How can I make gunpowder on my ship when I have no saltpeter, sulfur, or charcoal?" "Even so," I replied, "to fire underwater in a medium that's 855 times denser than air, you'd have to overcome considerable resistance." "That doesn't necessarily follow. There are certain Fulton-type guns perfected by the Englishmen Philippe Coles and Burley, the Frenchman Forcy, and the Italian Landi. They're equipped with a special system of airtight fastenings and can fire in underwater conditions. But, I repeat, having no gunpowder, I've replaced it with air at high pressure, which is abundantly supplied me by the Nautilus's pumps." But this air must be swiftly depleted. Well, in a pinch, can't my room-quay-roll tank supply me with more? All I have to do is draw it from an ad hoc spigot. Besides, Professor Aronnax, you'll see for yourself that during these underwater hunting trips we make no great expenditure of either air or bullets. But it seems to me that in this semi-darkness, amid this liquid that's so dense in comparison to the atmosphere, a gunshot couldn't carry far and would prove fatal only with difficulty. On the contrary, sir, with this rifle every shot is fatal, and as soon as the animal is hit, no matter how lightly, it falls, as if struck by lightning. Why? Because this rifle doesn't shoot ordinary bullets, but little glass capsules invented by the Austrian chemist Lieningbrock, and I have a considerable supply of them. These glass capsules are covered with a strip of steel and weighted with a lead base. They're genuine little Leyden jars charged with high-voltage electricity. They go off at the slightest impact, and the animal, no matter how strong, drops dead. I might add that these capsules are no bigger than number 4 shot, and the chamber of any ordinary rifle could hold 10 of them. I'll quit debating, I replied, getting up from the table, and all that's left for me is to shoulder my rifle. So where you go, I'll go. Captain Nemo led me to the Nautilus's stern, and passing by Ned and Conseil's cabin, I summoned my 2 companions, who instantly followed us. Then we arrived at a cell located within easy access of the engine room. In this cell, we were to get dressed for our stroll. Chapter 16. Strolling the Plains. This cell, properly speaking, was the Nautilus's arsenal and wardrobe. Hanging from its walls, a dozen diving outfits were waiting for anybody who wanted to take a stroll. After seeing these, Ned Land exhibited an obvious distaste for the idea of putting one on. But my gallant Ned, I told him, the forests of Crespo Island are simply underwater forests. Oh, great, put in the disappointed harpooner, watching his dreams of fresh meat fade away. And you, Professor Aronnax, are you going to stick yourself inside these clothes? It has to be, Mr. Ned. Have it your way, sir, the harpooner replied, shrugging his shoulders. But speaking for myself, I'll never get into those things unless they force me. No one will force you, Mr. Land, Captain Nemo said. And is Conseil going to risk it? Ned asked. Where master goes, I go, Conseil replied. At the captain's summons, 2 crewmen came to help us put on these heavy waterproof clothes, made from seamless India rubber and expressly designed to bear considerable pressures. They were like suits of armor that were both yielding and resistant, you might say. These clothes consisted of jacket and pants. The pants ended in bulky footwear adorned with heavy lead soles. The fabric of the jacket was reinforced with copper mail that shielded the chest, protected it from the water's pressure, and allowed the lungs to function freely. The sleeves ended in supple gloves that didn't impede hand movements. These perfected diving suits, it was easy to see, were a far cry from such misshapen costumes as the cork breastplates, leather jumpers, seagoing tunics, barrel hammocks, helmets, etc., invented and acclaimed in the 18th century. Conseil and I were soon dressed in these diving suits, as were Captain Nemo and one of his companions, a Herculean type who must have been prodigiously strong. All that remained was to encase one's head in its metal sphere. But before proceeding with this operation, I asked the captain for permission to examine the rifles set aside for us. One of the Nautilus's men presented me with a streamlined rifle whose butt was boilerplate steel, hollow inside and of fairly large dimensions. This served as a tank for the compressed air, which a trigger-operated valve could release into the metal chamber. In a groove where the butt was heaviest, a cartridge clip held some 20 electric bullets that, by means of a spring, automatically took their places in the barrel of the rifle. As soon as one shot had been fired, another was ready to go off. Captain Nemo, I said, this is an ideal, easy-to-use weapon. I ask only to put it to the test. But how will we reach the bottom of the sea? Right now, Professor, the Nautilus is aground in 10 meters of water, and we've only to depart. But how will we set out? You'll see. Captain Nemo inserted his cranium into its spherical headgear. Conseil and I did the same, but not without hearing the Canadian cause us a sarcastic, "Happy hunting!" On top, the suit ended in a collar of threaded copper onto which the metal helmet was screwed. 3 holes, protected by heavy glass, allowed us to see in any direction with simply a turn of the head inside the sphere. Placed on our backs, the The Rouquet roll device went into operation as soon as it was in position, and for my part, I could breathe with ease. The Ruhmkorff lamp hanging from my belt, my rifle in hand, I was ready to go forth. But in all honesty, while imprisoned in these heavy clothes and nailed to the deck by my lead soles, it was impossible for me to take a single step. But this circumstance had been foreseen, because I felt myself propelled into a little room adjoining the wardrobe. Towed in the same way, my companions went with me. I heard a door with watertight seals close after us, and we were surrounded by profound darkness. After some minutes, a sharp hissing reached my ears. I felt a distinct sensation of cold rising from my feet to my chest. Apparently, a stopcock inside the boat was letting in water from outside, which overran us and soon filled up the room. Contrived in the Nautilus's side, a second door then opened. We were lit by a subdued light. An instant later, our feet were treading the bottom of the sea. And now, how can I convey the impressions left on me by this stroll under the waters? Words are powerless to describe such wonders. When even the painter's brush can't depict the effects unique to the liquid element, how can the writer's pen hope to reproduce them? Captain Nemo walked in front, and his companion followed us a few steps to the rear. Conseil and I stayed next to each other, as if daydreaming that through our metal carapaces, a little polite conversation might still be possible. Already I no longer felt the bulkiness of my clothes, footwear, and air tank, nor the weight of the heavy sphere inside which my head was rattling like an almond in a shell. Once immersed in water, all these objects lost a part of their weight equal to the weight of the liquid they displaced, and thanks to this law of physics discovered by Archimedes, I did just fine. I was no longer an inert mass, and I had, comparatively speaking, great freedom of movement. Lighting up the seafloor even 30 feet beneath the surface of the ocean, the sun astonished me with its power. The solar rays easily crossed this aqueous mass and dispersed its dark colors. I could easily distinguish objects 100 meters away. Further on, the bottom was tinted with fine shades of aquamarine. Then, off in the distance, it turned blue and faded in the midst of a hazy darkness. Truly, this water surrounding me was just a kind of air, denser than the atmosphere on land, but almost as transparent. Above me, I could see the calm surface of the ocean. We were walking on sand that was fine-grained and smooth, not wrinkled like beach sand, which preserves the impressions left by the waves. This dazzling carpet was a real mirror, throwing back the sun's rays with startling intensity. The outcome, an immense vista of reflections that penetrated every liquid molecule. Will anyone believe me if I assert that at its 30-foot depth I could see as if it were broad daylight? For a quarter of an hour I trod this blazing sand, which was strewn with tiny crumbs of seashell. Looming like a long reef, the Nautilus's hull disappeared little by little, but when night fell in the midst of the waters, the ship's beacon would surely facilitate our return on board, since its rays carried with perfect distinctness. This effect is difficult to understand for anyone who has never seen light beams so sharply defined on shore. There, the dust that saturates the air gives such rays the appearance of a luminous fog, but above water as well as underwater, shafts of electric light are transmitted with incomparable clarity. Meanwhile, we went ever onward, and these vast plains of sand seemed endless. My hands parted liquid curtains that closed again behind me, and my footprints faded swiftly under the water's pressure. Soon, scarcely blurred by their distance from us, the forms of some object took shape before my eyes. I recognized the lower slopes of some magnificent rocks carpeted by the finest zoophyte specimens, and right off I was struck by an effect unique to this medium. By then it was 10 o'clock in the morning. The sun's rays hit the surface of the waves at a fairly oblique angle, decomposing by refraction as though passing through a prism, and when this light came in contact with flowers, rocks, buds, seashells, and polyps, the edges of these objects were shaded with all 7 hues of the solar spectrum. This riot of rainbow tints was a wonder, a feast for the eyes, a genuine kaleidoscope of red, green, yellow, orange, violet, indigo, and blue, in short, the whole palette of a color-happy painter. If only I had been able to share with Conseil the intense sensations rising in my brain, competing with him in exclamations of wonderment. If only I had known, like Captain Nemo and his companion, how to exchange thoughts by means of prearranged signals. So, For lack of anything better, I talked to myself. I declaimed inside this copper box that topped my head, spending more air on empty words than was perhaps advisable. Conseil, like me, had stopped before this splendid sight. Obviously, in the presence of these zoophyte and mollusk specimens, the fine lad was classifying his head off. Polyps and echinoderms abounded on the seafloor, various Isis coral, cornellarian coral living in isolation, tufts of virginal genus Oculina, formerly known by the name white coral, prickly fungus coral in the shape of mushrooms, sea anemone holding on by their muscular discs, providing a literal flower bed adorned by jellyfish from the genus Porpita wearing collars of azure tentacles, and starfish that spangled the sand, including vein-like feather stars from the genus Asteriophyton, that were like fine lace embroidered by the hands of water nymphs, their festoons swaying to the faint undulations caused by our walking. It filled me with real chagrin to crush underfoot the gleaming mollusk samples that littered the seafloor by the thousands. Concentric comb shells, hammer shells, coquina, seashells that actually hop around, top shell snails, red helmet shells, angel wing conchs, sea hares, and so many other exhibits from this inexhaustible ocean. But we had to keep walking, and we went forward while overhead there scudded schools of Portuguese man-o'-war that let their ultramarine tentacles drift in their wakes, medusas whose milky white or dainty pink parasols were festooned with azure tassels and shaded us from the sun's rays, plus jellyfish of the species Pelagia panopyra that, in the dark, would have strewn our path with phosphorescent glimmers. All these wonders I glimpsed in the space of a quarter of a mile, barely pausing, following Captain Nemo, whose gestures kept beckoning me onward. Soon the nature of the seafloor changed. The plains of sand were followed by a bed of that viscous slime Americans call ooze, which is composed exclusively of seashells rich in limestone or silica. Then we crossed a prairie of algae, open sea plants that the waters hadn't yet torn loose, whose vegetation grew in wild profusion. Soft to the foot, these densely textured lawns would have rivaled the most luxuriant carpets woven by the hand of man. But while this greenery was sprawling under our steps, it didn't neglect us overhead. The surface of the water was crisscrossed by a floating arbor of marine plants belonging to that superabundant algae family that numbers more than 2,000 known species. I saw long ribbons of fucus drifting above me, some globular, some tubular. Laurentia cladostophus with the slenderest foliage, Rhodemia palmata resembling the fan shapes of cactus. I observed that green-colored plants kept closer to the surface of the sea, while reds occupied a medium depth, which left blacks and browns in charge of designing gardens and flower beds in the ocean's lower strata. These algae are a genuine prodigy of creation, one of the wonders of world flora. This family produces both the biggest and smallest vegetables in the world, because just as 40,000 near-invisible buds have been counted in one 5 square millimeter space, so also have ficus plants been gathered that were over 500 meters long. We had been gone from the Nautilus for about an hour and a half. It was almost noon. I spotted this fact in the perpendicularity of the sun's rays, which were no longer refracted. The magic of these solar colors disappeared little by little, with emerald and sapphire shades vanishing from our surroundings altogether. We walked with steady steps that rang on the seafloor with astonishing intensity. The tiniest sounds were transmitted with a speed to which the ear was unaccustomed on shore. In fact, water is a better conductor of sound than air, and under the waves noises carry 4 times as fast. Just then the seafloor began to slope sharply downward. The light took on a uniform hue. We reached a depth of 100 meters, by which point we were undergoing a pressure of 10 atmospheres. But my diving clothes were built along such lines that I never suffered from this pressure. I only felt a certain tightness in the joints of my fingers, and even this discomfort soon disappeared. As for the exhaustion bound to accompany a 2-hour stroll in such unfamiliar trappings, it was nil. Helped by the water, my movements were executed with startling ease. Arriving at this 300-foot depth, I still detected the sun's rays, but just barely. Their intense brilliance had been followed by a reddish twilight, a midpoint between day and night. But we could see well enough to find our way, and it still wasn't necessary to activate the Ruhmkorff device. Just then, Captain Nemo stopped. He waited until I joined him, and then he pointed a finger at some dark masses outlined in the shadows a short distance away. It's the forest of Crespo Island, I thought, and I was not mistaken. Chapter 17. An Underwater Forest. We had finally arrived on the outskirts of this forest, surely one of the finest in Captain Nemo's immense domains. He regarded it as his own, and had laid the same claim to it that, in the first days of the world, the first men had to their axes on land, had to their forests on land. Besides, who else could dispute his ownership of this underwater property? What other, bolder pioneer would come, axe in hand, to clear away its dark underbrush? This forest was made up of big tree-like plants, and when we had entered beneath their huge arches, my eyes were instantly struck by the unique arrangement of the branches, an arrangement which I had never before encountered. None of the weeds carpeting the sea floor, none of the branches bristling from the shrubbery, crept or leaned or stretched on a horizontal plane. They all rose right up towards the surface of the ocean. Every filament or ribbon, no matter how thin, stood ramrod straight. Fucus plants and creepers were growing in stiff, perpendicular lines, governed by the destiny of the element that generated them. After I parted them with my hands, these otherwise motionless plants would shoot right back to their accustomed positions. It was the regimen of verticality. I soon grew accustomed to this bizarre arrangement, likewise to the comparative darkness surrounding us. The seafloor in this forest was strewn with sharp chunks of stone that were hard to avoid. Here the range of underwater flora seemed pretty comprehensive to me, as well as more abundant than it might have been in the Arctic or tropical zones, where such exhibits are less common. But for a few minutes I kept accidentally confusing the two kingdoms, mistaking zoophytes for water plants, animals for vegetables. Who hasn't made the same blunder? Flora and fauna are so closely associated in the underwater world. I observed that all these exhibits from the vegetable kingdom were attached to the seafloor by only the most makeshift methods. They had no roots and didn't care which solid objects secured them, sand, shells, husks, or pebbles. They didn't ask their host for sustenance, just a point of purchase. These plants are entirely self-propagating, and the principle of their existence lies in the water that sustains and nourishes them. In place of leaves, most of them sprouted blades of unpredictable shape, which were confined to a narrow gamut of colors consisting only of pink, crimson, green, olive, tan, and brown. There I saw again, but not yet pressed and dried like the Nautilus's specimens, some peacock's tails spread open like fans to stir up a cooling breeze, scarlet rose tangles, sea tangles stretching out their young and edible roots, twisting strings of kelp from the genus Nereocystisus, that bloomed to a height of 15 meters, bouquets of mermaids' cups whose stems grew wider at the top, and a number of other open sea plants, all without flowers. It's an odd anomaly in this bizarre element, as one witty naturalist put it. The animal kingdom blossoms, and the vegetable kingdom doesn't. These various types of shrubbery were as big as trees in the temperate zones. In the damp shade between them there were clustered actual bushes of moving flowers, hedges of zoophytes in which there grew stony coral striped with twisting furrows, yellowish sea anemone from the genus Caryophylla with translucent tentacles, plus anemone with grassy tufts from the genus Zoantharia, and to complete the illusion, minnows flitted from branch to branch like a swarm of hummingbirds, with a rose underfoot like a covey of snipe, yellow fish from the genus Lepidosidocanthus, with bristling jaws and sharp scales, flying goonards, and pinecone fish. Near 1 o'clock, Captain Nemo gave the signal to halt. Speaking for myself, I was glad to oblige, and we stretched out beneath an arbor of winged kelp, whose long, thin tendrils stood up like arrows. This short break was a delight. It lacked only the charm of conversation. But it was impossible to speak, impossible to reply. I simply nudged my big copper headpiece against Conseil's headpiece. I saw a happy gleam in the gallant lad's eyes, and to communicate his pleasure, he jiggled around in his carapace in the world's silliest way. After 4 hours of strolling, I was quite astonished not to feel any intense hunger. What kept my stomach in such a good mood, I'm unable to say. But in exchange, I've experienced that irresistible desire for sleep that comes over every diver. Accordingly, my eyes soon closed beneath their heavy glass windows, and I fell into an uncontrollable doze, which until then I had been able to fight off only through the movements of our walking. Captain Nemo and his muscular companion were already stretched out in this clear crystal, setting us a fine nap-time example. How long I was sunk in this torpor I cannot estimate, but when I awoke it seemed as if the sun were settling toward the horizon. Captain Nemo was already up, and I had started to stretch my limbs when an unexpected apparition brought me sharply to my feet. A few paces away, a monstrous, meter-high sea spider was staring at me with beady eyes, poised to spring at me. Although my diving suit was heavy enough to protect me from this animal's bites, I couldn't keep back a shudder of horror. Just then Conseil woke up, together with the Nautilus's sailor. Captain Nemo alerted his companion to this hideous crustacean, which a swing of the rifle butt quickly brought down, and I watched the monster's horrible legs writhing in dreadful convulsions. This encounter reminded me that other, more daunting animals must be lurking in these dark reaches, and my diving suit might not be adequate protection against their attacks. Such thoughts hadn't previously crossed my mind, and I was determined to keep on my guard. Meanwhile, I had assumed this rest period would be the turning point in our stroll, but I was mistaken, and instead of heading back to the Nautilus, Captain Nemo continued his daring excursion. The seafloor kept sinking, and its significantly steeper slope took us to greater depths. It must have been nearly 3 o'clock when we reached a narrow valley gouged between high vertical walls and located 150 meters down. Thanks to the perfection of our equipment, we had thus gone 90 meters below the limit that nature had, until then, set on man's underwater excursions. I say 150 meters, although I had no instruments for estimating this distance, but I knew that the sun's rays, even in the clearest seas, could reach no further. So at precisely this point, the darkness became profound. Not a single object was visible past 10 paces. Consequently, I had begun to grope my way when suddenly I saw the glow of an intense white light. Captain Nemo had just activated his electric device. His companion did likewise. Conseil and I followed suit. By turning a switch, I established contact between the induction coil and the glass spiral, and the sea, lit up by our 4 lanterns, was illuminated for a radius of 25 meters. Captain Nemo continued to plummet into the dark depths of this forest, whose shrubbery grew even more sparse. I observed that vegetable life was disappearing more quickly than animal life. The open sea plants had already left behind the increasingly arid seafloor, where a prodigious number of animals were still swarming: zoophytes, articulates, mollusks, and fish. While we were walking, I thought the lights of our Ruhmkorff devices would automatically attract some inhabitants of these dark strata. But if they did approach us, at least they kept at a distance regrettable from the hunter's standpoint. Several times I saw Captain Nemo stop and take aim with his rifle. Then, after sighting down its barrel for a few seconds, he would straighten up and resume his walk. Finally, at around 4 o'clock, this marvelous excursion came to an end. A wall of superb rocks stood before us, imposing in its sheer mass. A pile of gigantic stone blocks, a single granite cliffside pitted with dark caves, but not offering a single gradient we could climb up. This was the underpinning of Crespo Island. This was land. The captain stopped suddenly. A gesture from him brought us to a halt, and however much I wanted to clear this wall, I had to stop. Here entered the domains of Captain Nemo. He had no desire to pass beyond them. Further on lay a part of the globe he would no longer tread underfoot. Our return journey began. Captain Nemo resumed the lead in our little band, always heading forward without hesitation. I noted that we didn't follow the same path in returning to the Nautilus. This new route, very steep and hence very arduous, quickly took us close to the surface of the sea. But this return to the upper strata wasn't so sudden that decompression took place too quickly, which could have led to serious organic disorders and given us those internal injuries so fatal to divers. With great promptness, the light reappeared and grew stronger, and the refraction of the sun, already low on the horizon, again ringed the edges of various objects with the entire color spectrum. At a depth of 10 meters, we walked amid a swarm of small fish from every species, more numerous than birds in the air, more agile, too. But no aquatic game worthy of a gunshot had yet been offered to our eyes. Just then I saw the captain's weapon spring to his shoulder and track a moving object through the bushes. A shot went off, I heard a faint hissing, and an animal dropped a few paces away, literally struck by lightning. It was a magnificent sea otter from the genus Enhydra, the only exclusively marine quadruped. 1.5 meters long, this otter had to be worth a good high price. Its coat, chestnut brown above and silver below, would have made one of those wonderful fur pieces so much in demand in the Chinese and Russian markets. The fineness and luster of its pelt guaranteed that it would go for at least $2,000. I was full of wonderment at this unusual mammal, with its circular head adorned by short ears, its round eyes, its white whiskers like those on a cat, its webbed and clawed feet, its bushy tail. Hunted and trapped by fishermen, this valuable carnivore has become extremely rare, and it takes refuge in the northernmost parts of the Pacific, where in all likelihood its species will soon be facing extinction. Captain Nemo's companion picked up the animal, loaded it on his shoulder, and we took to the trail again. For an hour, plains of sand unrolled before our eyes. Often the seafloor rose to within 2 meters of the surface of the water. I could then see our images clearly mirrored on the underside of the waves, but reflected upside down. Above us there appeared an identical band that duplicated our every movement and gesture. In short, a perfect likeness of the quartet near which it walked, but with heads down and feet in the air. Another unusual effect. Heavy clouds passed above us, forming and fading swiftly. But after thinking it over, I realized that these so-called clouds were caused simply by the changing densities of the long ground swells, and I even spotted the foaming whitecaps that their breaking crests were proliferating over the surface of the water. Lastly, I couldn't help seeing the actual shadows of large birds passing over our heads, swiftly skimming the surface of the sea. On this occasion, I witnessed one of the finest gunshots ever to thrill the marrow of a hunter. A large bird with a wide wingspan, quite clearly visible, approached and hovered over us. When it was just a few meters above the waves, Captain Nemo's companion took aim and fired. The animal dropped, electrocuted, and its descent brought it within reach of our adroit hunter, who promptly took possession of it. It was an albatross of the finest species, a wonderful specimen of these open sea fowl. This incident did not interrupt our walk. For 2 hours we were sometimes led over plains of sand, sometimes over prairies of seaweed that were quite arduous to cross. In all honesty, I was dead tired by the time I spotted a hazy glow half a mile away, cutting through the darkness of the water. It was the Nautilus's beacon. Within 20 minutes we'd be on board, and there I could breathe easy again, because my tank's current air supply seemed to be quite low in oxygen. But I was reckoning without an encounter that slightly delayed our arrival. I was lagging behind some 20 paces when I saw Captain Nemo suddenly come back toward me. With his powerful hands, he sent me buckling to the ground, while his companion did the same on Seal. At first, I didn't know what to make of this sudden assault, but I was reassured to observe the captain lying motionless beside me. I was stretched out on the seafloor directly beneath some bushes of algae when I raised my head and spied 2 enormous masses hurtling by, throwing off phosphorescent glimmers. My blood turned cold in my veins. I saw that we were under threat from a fearsome pair of sharks. They were blue sharks, dreadful man-eaters with enormous tails, dull, glassy stares, and phosphorescent matter oozing from holes around their snouts. They were like monstrous fireflies that could thoroughly pulverize a man in their iron jaws. I don't know if Conseil was busy with their classification, but as for me, I looked at their silver bellies, their fearsome mouths bristling with teeth, from a viewpoint less than scientific, more as a victim than as a professor of natural history. Luckily, these voracious animals have poor eyesight. They went by without noticing us, grazing us with their brownish fins, and miraculously, we escaped a danger greater than encountering a tiger deep in the jungle. Half an hour later, guided by its electric trail, we reached the Nautilus. The outside door had been left open, and Captain Nemo closed it after we re-entered the first cell. Then he pressed a button. I heard pumps operating within the ship. I felt the water lowering around me, and in a few moments the cell was completely empty. The inside door opened, and we passed into the wardrobe. There our diving suits were removed, not without difficulty, and utterly exhausted, faint from lack of food and rest, I repaired to my stateroom, full of wonder at this startling excursion on the bottom of the sea. Chapter 18. 4,000 Leagues Under the Pacific. By the next morning, November 18th, I was fully recovered from my exhaustion of the day before. and I climbed onto the platform just as the Nautilus's chief officer was pronouncing his daily phrase. It then occurred to me that these words either referred to the state of the sea or that they meant, "There's nothing in sight." And in truth, the ocean was deserted, not a sail on the horizon. The tips of Crespo Island had disappeared during the night. The sea, absorbing every color of the prism except its blue rays, reflected the latter in every direction and sported a wonderful indigo tint. The undulating waves regularly took on the appearance of watered silk with wide stripes. I was marveling at this magnificent ocean view when Captain Nemo appeared. He didn't seem to notice my presence and began a series of astronomical observations. Then, his operations finished, he went and leaned his elbows on the beacon housing, his eyes straying over the surface of the ocean. Meanwhile, some 20 of the Nautilus's sailors, all energetic, well-built fellows, climbed onto the platform. They had come to pull up the nets left in our wake during the night. These seamen obviously belonged to different nationalities, although indications of European physical traits could be seen in them all. If I'm not mistaken, I recognized some Irishmen, some Frenchmen, a few Slavs, and a native of either Greece or Crete. Even so, these men were frugal of speech and used among themselves only that bizarre dialect whose origin I couldn't even guess, so I had to give up any notions of questioning them. The nets were hauled on board. They were a breed of trawl resembling those used off the Normandy coast, huge pouches held half open by a floating pole and a chain laced through the lower meshes. Trailing in this way from these iron glove makers, the resulting receptacles scoured the ocean floor and collected every marine exhibit in their path. That day they gathered up some unusual specimens from these fish-filled waterways, anglerfish whose comical movements qualify them for the epithet clowns, black commercent anglers equipped with their antennas, undulating triggerfish encircled by little red bands, bloated puffers whose venom is extremely insidious, some olive-hued lampreys, snipefish covered with silver scales, cutlass fish whose electrocuting power equals that of the electric eel and the electric ray, scaly featherbacks with brawn crosswise bands, greenish codfish, several varieties of goby, etc., finally some fish of larger proportions, a 1-meter jack with a prominent head, several fine bonito from the genus Scomber, decked out in the colors blue and silver, and 3 magnificent tuna whose high speeds couldn't save them from our trawl. I estimate that in this cast of the net brought in more than 1,000 pounds of fish. It was a fine catch, but not surprising. In essence, these nets stayed in our wake for several hours, incarcerating an entire aquatic world in prisons made of thread. So we were never lacking in provisions of the highest quality, which the Nautilus's speed and the allure of its electric light could continually replenish. These various exhibits from the sea were immediately lowered down the hatch in the direction of the storage lockers, some to be eaten fresh, others to be preserved. After its fishing was finished and its air supply renewed, I thought the Nautilus would resume its underwater excursion, and I was getting ready to return to my stateroom when Captain Nemo turned to me and said without further preamble, "Look at this ocean, Professor. Doesn't it have the actual gift of life? Doesn't it experience both anger and affection? Last night it went to sleep just as we did, and there it is, waking up after a peaceful night. No hellos or good mornings for this gent. You would have thought this eccentric individual was simply continuing a conversation we'd already started. See," he went on, "it's waking up under the sun's caresses. It's going to relive its daily existence. What a fascinating field of study lies in watching the play of its organism. It owns a pulse and arteries. It has spasms, and I side with the scholarly Commander Maury, who discovered that it has a circulation as real as the circulation of blood in animals." I was sure that Captain Nemo expected no replies from me, and it seemed pointless to pitch in with, "Ah, yes, exactly," or "How right you are." Rather, he was simply talking to himself, with long pauses between sentences. He was meditating out loud. "Yes," he said, "the ocean owns a genuine circulation, and to start it going, the creator of all things has only to increase its heat, salt, and microscopic animal life. In essence, heat creates the different densities that lead to currents and countercurrents. Evaporation, which is nil in the high Arctic regions and very active in equatorial zones, brings about a constant interchange of tropical and polar waters. What's more, I've detected those falling and rising currents that make up the ocean's true breathing. I've seen a molecule of salt water heat up at the surface, sink into the depths, reach maximum density at -2 degrees centigrade, and then cool off, grow lighter, and rise again. At the poles, you'll see the consequences of this phenomenon, And through this law of far-seeing nature, you'll understand why water can freeze only at the surface. As the captain was finishing his sentence, I said to myself, the pole? Is this brazen individual claiming he'll take us even to that location? Meanwhile, the captain fell silent and stared at the element he had studied so thoroughly and unceasingly. Then, going on, salts, he said, filled the sea in considerable quantities, Professor. And if you removed all its dissolved saline content, you'd create a mass measuring 4,500,000 cubic leagues, which, if it were spread all over the globe, would form a layer more than 10 meters high. And don't think that the presence of these salts is due merely to some whim of nature. No, they make ocean water less open to evaporation and prevent winds from carrying off excessive amounts of steam, which, when condensing, would submerge the temporal zones. Salts play a leading role, the role of stabilizer for the general ecology of the globe. Captain Nemo stopped, straightened up, took a few steps along the platform, and returned to me. As for these billions of tiny animals, he went on, those infusora that live by the millions in one droplet of water, 800,000 of which are needed to weigh 1 milligram, their role is no less important. They absorb the marine salts, they assimilate the solid elements in the water, and since they create coral and madrepores, they're the true builders of limestone continents. And so, after they finish depriving our water drop of its mineral nutrients, the droplet gets lighter, rises to the surface, there absorbs more salts left behind through evaporation, gets heavier, sinks again, and brings those tiny animals new elements to absorb. The outcome? A double current, rising and falling, constant movement, constant life. More intense than on land, more abundant, more infinite, such life blooms in every part of this ocean. An element fatal to man, they say, but vital to myriads of animals, and to me. When Captain Nemo spoke in this way, he was transfigured, and he filled me with extraordinary excitement. There, he added, out there lies true existence. And I can imagine the founding of nautical towns, clusters of underwater households that, like the Nautilus, would return to the surface of the sea to breathe each morning, free towns if ever there were, independent cities. Then again, who knows whether some tyrant... Captain Nemo finished his sentence with a vehement gesture. Then, addressing me directly, as if to drive away an ugly thought, Professor Aronnax, he asked me, do you know the depth of the ocean floor? At least, Captain, I know what the major soundings tell us. Could you quote them to me so I can double-check them as the need arises? Here, I replied, are a few of them that stick in my memory. If I'm not mistaken, an average depth of 8,200 meters was found in the North Atlantic and 2,500 meters in the Mediterranean. The most remarkable soundings were taken in the South Atlantic near the 35th parallel, and they gave 12,000 meters, 14,091 meters, and 15,149 meters. All in all, it's estimated that if the sea bottom were made level, its average depth would be about 7 kilometers. Well, Professor, Captain Nemo replied, we'll show you better than that, I hope. As for the average depth of this part of the Pacific, I'll inform you that it's a mere 4,000 meters. This said, Captain Nemo headed to the hatch and disappeared down the ladder. I followed him and went back to the main lounge. The propeller was instantly set in motion, and the log gave our speed as 20 miles per hour. Over the ensuing days and weeks, Captain Nemo was very frugal with his visits. I saw him only at rare intervals. His chief officer regularly fixed the positions I found reported on the chart, and in such a way that I could exactly plot the Nautilus's course. Conseil and Land spent the long hours with me. Conseil had told his friend about the wonders of our undersea stroll, and the Canadian was sorry he hadn't gone along. But I hoped an opportunity would arise for visits to the forests of Oceania. Almost every day the panels in the lounge were open for some hours, and our eyes never tired of probing the mysteries of the underwater world. The Nautilus's general heading was southeast, and it stayed at a depth between 100 and 150 meters. However, from Lord knows what whim, one day it did a diagonal dive by means of its slanting fins, reaching strata located 2,000 meters underwater. The thermometer indicated a temperature of 4.25 degrees centigrade, which at this depth seemed to be a temperature common to all latitudes. On November 26, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the Nautilus cleared the Tropic of Cancer at longitude 172 degrees. On the 27th, it passed in sight of the Hawaiian Islands, where the famous Captain Cook met his death on February 14, 1779. By then we had fared 4,860 leagues from our starting point. When I arrived on the platform that morning, I saw the island of Hawaii 2 miles to leeward, the largest of the 7 islands making up this group. I could clearly distinguish the tilled soil on its outskirts, the various mountain chains running parallel with its coastline, and its volcanoes crowned by Mauna Kea, whose elevation is 5,000 meters above sea level. Among other specimens from these waterways, our nets brought up some peacock-tailed flabellarian coral, polyps flattened into stylish shapes and unique to this part of the ocean. The Nautilus kept to its southeasterly heading. On December the 1st, it cut the equator at longitude 142 degrees, and on the 4th of the same month, after a quick crossing marked by no incident, we reached the Marquesas Islands. 3 miles off, in latitude 8 degrees 57 south and longitude 139 degrees 32 west, I spotted Martin Point on Nukuhiva, chief member of this island group that belongs to France. I could make out only its wooden mountains on the horizon because Captain Nemo hated to hug shore. There, our nets brought up some fine fish samples, dolphin fish with azure fins, gold tails, and flesh that's unrivaled in the entire world. Race from the genus Hologymnosus that were nearly denuded of scales but exquisite in flavor. Knife jaws with bony beaks, yellowish albacore that were as tasty as bonito, all fish worth classifying in the ship's pantry. After leaving these delightful islands to the protection of the French flag, the Nautilus covered about 2,000 miles from December 4th to the 11th. Its navigating was marked by an encounter with an immense school of squid, unusual mollusks that are near neighbors of the cuttlefish. French fishermen give them the name cuckold fish, and they belong to the class Cephalopoda, family Dibranchiata, consisting of themselves together with cuttlefish and argonauts. The naturalists of antiquity made a special study of them, and these animals furnish many ribald figures of speech for soapbox orators in the Greek marketplace, as well as excellent dishes for the tables of rich citizens, if you were to believe Athenaeus, a Greek physician predating Galen. It was during the night of December 9th to 10th that the Nautilus encountered this army of distinctly nocturnal mollusks. They numbered in the millions. They were migrating from the temperate zones towards zones still warmer, following the itineraries of herring and sardines. We stared at them through our thick glass windows. They swam backward with tremendous speed, moving by means of their locomotive tubes, chasing fish and mollusks, eating the little ones, eaten by the big ones, and tossing in indescribable confusion the 10 feet that nature has rooted in their heads like a hairpiece of pneumatic snakes. Despite its speed, the Nautilus navigated for several hours in the midst of this school of animals, and its nets brought up an incalculable number, among which I recognized all 9 species that Professor Orbigny has classified as native to the Pacific Ocean. During this crossing, the sea continually lavished us with the most marvelous sights. Its variety was infinite. It changed its setting and decor for the mere pleasure of our eyes, and we were called upon not simply to contemplate the works of our Creator in the midst of the liquid element, but also to probe the ocean's most daunting mysteries. During the day of December 11th, I was busy reading in the main lounge. Ned Land and Conseil were observing the luminous waters through the gaping panels. The Nautilus was motionless. Its ballast tanks full, it was sitting at a depth of 1,000 meters in a comparatively unpopulated region of the ocean, where only larger fish put in occasional appearances. Just then I was studying a delightful book by Jean Mace, The Servants of the Stomach, and savoring its ingenious teachings, when Conseil interrupted my reading. "Would master kindly come here for an instant?" he said to me in an odd voice. "What is it, Conseil?" "It's something master should see." I stood up, went, leaned on my elbows before the window, and I saw it. In the broad electric daylight, an enormous black mass, quite motionless, hung suspended in the midst of the waters. I observed it carefully, trying to find out the nature of this giant cetacean. Then a sudden thought crossed my mind. "A ship!" I exclaimed. "Yes," the Canadian replied. "A disabled craft that's sinking straight down." Ned Land was not mistaken. We were in the presence of a ship whose severed shrouds still hung from their clasps. Its hull looked in good condition, and it must have gone under only a few hours before. The stumps of 3 masts, chopped off 2 feet above the deck, indicated a flooded ship that had been forced to sacrifice its masting. But it had heeled sideways, filling completely, and it was listing to port even yet. A sorry sight, this carcass lost under the waves, but sorrier still was the sight on its deck, where, lashed with ropes to prevent their being washed overboard, some human corpses still lay. I counted 4 of them, 4 men, one still standing at the helm, then a woman, halfway out of a skylight on the afterdeck, holding a child in her arms. This woman was young. Under the brilliant lighting of the Nautilus's rays, I could make out her features, which the water hadn't yet decomposed. With a supreme effort, she had lifted her child above her head, and the poor little creature's arms were still twined around its mother's neck. The postures of the 4 seamen seemed ghastly to me, twisted from convulsive movements, as if making a last effort to break loose from the ropes that bound them to their ship. And the helmsman, standing alone, calmer, his face smooth and serious, his grizzled hair plastered to his brow, his hands clutching the wheel, seemed even yet to be guiding his wrecked 3-master through the ocean depths. What a scene! We stood dumbstruck, hearts pounding, before this ship caught in the act, as if it had been photographed in its final moments, so to speak. And already I could see enormous sharks moving in, eyes ablaze, drawn by the lure of human flesh. Meanwhile, turning, the Nautilus made a circle around the sinking ship, and for an instant I could read the board on its stern. The Florida, Sunderland, England. Chapter 19. Vanikoro. This dreadful sight was the first of a whole series of maritime catastrophes that the Nautilus would encounter on its run. When it plied more heavily traveled seas, we often saw wrecked hulls rotting in mid-water, and further down, cannons, shells, anchors, chains, and 1,000 other iron objects rusting away. Meanwhile, continually swept along by the Nautilus, where we lived in near isolation, we raised the Tuamotu Islands on December 11th, that old, dangerous group associated with the French global navigator Commander Bougainville. It stretches from Dulce Island to Lazareth Island over an area of 500 leagues from the east-southeast to the west-northwest, between latitude 13 degrees 30 and 23 degrees 50 south, and between longitude 125 degrees 30 and 151:30 west. This island group covers a surface area of 370 square leagues, and it's made up of some 60 subgroups, among which we noted the Gambier group, which is a French protectorate. These islands are coral formations. Thanks to the work of polyps, a slow but steady upheaval will someday connect these islands to each other. Later on, this new island will be fused to its neighboring island groups, and a 5th continent will stretch from New Zealand and New Caledonia as far as the Marquesas Islands. The day I expounded this theory to Captain Nemo, he answered me coldly, "The Earth doesn't need new continents, but new men." Sailor's luck led the Nautilus straight to Riau Island, one of the most unusual in this group, which was discovered in 1822 by Captain Bell aboard the Minerva. So I was able to study the madreporic process that has created the islands in this ocean. Madrepores, which one must guard against confusing with precious coral, clothe their tissue in a limestone crust, and their variations in structure have led my famous mentor, Professor Milne Edwards, to classify them into 5 divisions. The tiny microscopic animals that secrete this polypary live by the billions in the depths of their cells. Their limestone deposits build up into rocks, reefs, islets, islands. In some places they form atolls, a circular ring surrounding a lagoon or a small inner lake that gaps place in contact with the sea. Elsewhere they take the shape of barrier reefs, such as those that exist along the coasts of New Caledonia and several of the Tuamotu Islands. In still other localities, such as Reunion Island and the island of Mauritius, they build fringing reefs, high, straight walls next to which the ocean's depth is considerable. While cruising along only a few cable length from the underpinning of Riau Island, I marveled at the gigantic piece of work accomplished by these microscopic laborers. These walls were the express achievements of madrepores known by the names fire coral, finger coral, star coral, and stony coral. These polyps grow exclusively in the agitated strata at the surface of the sea, and so it's in the upper reaches that they begin these substructures, which sink little by little together with the secreted rubble binding them. This, At least is the theory of Mr. Charles Darwin, who thus explains the formation of atolls, a theory superior, in my view, to the one that says that these madreporic edifices sit on the summits of mountains or volcanoes submerged a few feet below sea level. I could observe these strange walls quite closely. Our sounding lines indicated they dropped perpendicularly for more than 300 meters, and our electric beams made the bright limestone positively sparkle. In response to a question Conseil asked me about the growth rate of these colossal barriers, I thoroughly amazed him by saying that scientists put it at 1/8 of an inch per biennium. Therefore, he said to me, to build these walls it took 1,192,000 years, my gallant Conseil, which significantly extends the biblical days of creation. What's more, the formation of coal, in other words, the petrification of forests swallowed by floods, and the cooling of basaltic rocks likewise called for a much longer period of time. I might add that those days in the Bible must represent whole epochs and not literally the lapse of time between two sunrises, because, according to the Bible itself, the sun doesn't date from the first day of creation. When the Nautilus returned to the surface of the ocean, I could take in Riau Island over its whole flat, wooded expanse. Obviously, its madreporic rocks have been made fertile by tornadoes and thunderstorms. One day, carried off by a hurricane from neighboring shores, some seed fell onto these limestone beds, mixing with decomposed particles of fish and marine plants to form human hummus, vegetable hummus. Propelled by the waves, a coconut arrived on this new coast. Its germ took root. Its tree grew tall, catching steam off the water. A brook was born. Little by little, vegetation spread. Tiny animals, worms, insects rode ashore on tree trunks snatched from islands to windward. Turtles came to lay their eggs. Birds nested in the young trees. In this way, animal life developed, and drawn by the greenery and fertile soil, man appeared. And that's how these islands were formed, the immense achievement of microscopic animals. Near evening, Riau Island melted into the distance, and the Nautilus noticeably changed course. After touching the Tropic of Capricorn at longitude 135 degrees, it headed west-northwest, going back up the whole intertropical zone. Although the summer sun lavished its rays on us, we never suffered from the heat, because 30 or 40 meters underwater, the temperature didn't go above 10 to 12 degrees centigrade. By December 15th, we had left the alluring Society Islands in the west, likewise elegant Tahiti, Queen of the Pacific. In the morning, I spotted this island's lofty summits a few miles to leeward. Its waters supplied excellent fish for the tables on board: mackerel, bonito, albacore, and a few varieties of that sea serpent named the moray eel. The Nautilus had cleared 8,100 miles. We logged 9,720 miles when we passed between the Tonga Islands, where crews from the Argo, Port-au-Prince, and Duke of Portland had perished, and the island group of Samoa, scene of the slaying of Captain de Longe, friend of that long-lost navigator, the Count de la Perouse. Then we raised the Fiji Islands, where savages slaughtered sailors from the Union, as well as Captain Bureau, commander of the Darling Josephine out of Nantes, France. Extending over an expanse of 100 leagues north to south and over 90 leagues east to west, this island group lies between latitude 2 degrees and 6 degrees south, and between longitude 174 and 179 degrees west. It consists of a number of islands, islets, and reef, among which we noted the islands of Viti Levu, Vanuatu, and Kadavu. It was the Dutch navigator Tasman who discovered this group in 1643, the same year the Italian physicist Torricelli invented the barometer, and King Louis XIV ascended the French throne. I'll let the reader decide which of these deeds was more beneficial to humanity. Coming later, Captain Cook in 1774, Rear Admiral d'Ancastro in 1793, and finally Captain Dumont d'Urberville in 1827 untangled the whole chaotic geography of this island group. The Nautilus drew near Wailea Bay, an unlucky place for England's Captain Dillon, who was the first to shed light on the long-standing mystery surrounding the disappearance of ships under the Count de la Perouse. This bay, repeatedly dredged, furnished a huge supply of excellent oysters. As the Roman playwright Seneca recommended, we opened them right at our table, then stuffed ourselves. These mollusks belong to the species known by name as Ostrea lemullosa, whose members are quite common off Corsica. This Wallia oysterbank must have been extensive, and for certain, if they hadn't been controlled by numerous natural checks, this cluster of shellfish would have ended up jam-packing the bay, since as many as 2 million eggs have been counted in a single individual. And if Mr. Ned Land did not repent of his gluttony at our oyster fest, it's because oysters are the only dish that never causes indigestion. In fact, it takes no less than 16 dozen of these headless mollusks to supply the 315 grams that satisfy one man's minimum daily requirement for nitrogen. On December 25th, the Nautilus navigated amid the island group of the New Hebrides, which the Portuguese seafarer Quiros discovered in 1606, which Commander Bougainville explored in 1768, and to which Captain Cook gave its current name in 1773. This group is chiefly made up of 9 large islands and forms a 120-league strip from the north-northwest to the south-southeast, lying between latitude 2 and 15 degrees south and between longitude 164 and 168 degrees. At the moment of our noon sights, we passed fairly close to the island of Ouro, which looked to me like a mass of green woods crowned by a peak of great height. That day it was Yuletide, and it struck me that Ned Land badly missed celebrating Christmas, that genuine family holiday where Protestants are such zealots. I hadn't seen Captain Nemo for over a week when, on the morning of the 27th, he entered the main lounge, as usual acting as if he'd been gone for just 5 minutes. I was busy tracing the Nautilus's course on the world map. The captain approached, placed a finger over a position on the chart, and pronounced just one word: Vanikoro. This name was magic. It was the name of one of those islets where vessels under the Count de la Pérouse had miscarried. I straightened suddenly. "The Nautilus is bringing us to Vanikoro?" I asked. "Yes, Professor," the captain replied. "And I'll be able to visit those famous islands where the compass and the astrolabe came to grief?" "If you like, Professor." "When will we reach Vanikoro?" "We already have, Professor." Followed by Captain Nemo, I climbed onto the platform, and from there my eyes eagerly scanned the horizon. In the northeast there emerged 2 volcanic islands of unequal size, surrounded by a coral reef whose circuit measured 40 miles. We were facing the island of Vanikoro proper, to which Captain Dumont d'Urberville had given the name Island of the Search. We lay right in front of the little harbor of Vanna, located in longitude 16 degrees 4 south and longitude 164 degrees 32 east. Its shores seemed covered with greenery from its beaches to its summit inland, crowned by Mount Capogo, which is 476 fathoms high. After clearing the outer belt of rocks via a narrow passageway, the Nautilus lay inside the breakers where the sea had a depth of 30 to 40 fathoms. Under the green shade of some tropical evergreens, I spotted a few savages who looked extremely startled at our approach. In this long, blackish object advancing flush with the water, didn't they see some fearsome cetacean that they were obliged to view with distrust? Just then, Captain Nemo asked me what I knew about the shipwreck of the Count de la Pérouse. "What everyone knows, Captain," I answered him. "And could you kindly tell me what everybody knows?" he asked me in a gently ironic tone. "Very easily." I related to him what the final deeds of Captain Dumont d'Urberville had brought to light, deeds described here in this heavily condensed summary of the whole matter. In 1785, the Count de la Pérouse and his subordinate, Captain de Lange, were sent by King Louis XVI of France on a voyage to circumnavigate the globe. They boarded 2 sloops of war, the Compass and the Astrolabe, which were never seen again. In 1791, justly concerned about the fate of these 2 sloops of war, the French government fitted out 2 large cargo boats, the Search and the Hope, which left Brest on September 28th under orders from Rear Admiral Bruni d'Encastro. 2 months later, testimony from a certain Commander Bowen aboard the Albemarle alleged that rubble from shipwrecked vessels had been seen on the coast of New Georgia. But D'Encastro was unaware of this news, which seemed a bit dubious anyhow, and headed towards the Admiralty Islands, which had been named in a report by one Captain Hunter as the site of the Count de la Pérouse's shipwreck. They looked in vain. The Hope and the Search passed right by Vanikoro without stopping there, and overall this voyage was plagued by misfortune, ultimately costing the lives of Rear Admiral D'Encastro, two of his subordinate officers, and several seamen from his crew. It was an old hand at the Pacific, the English adventurer Captain Peter Dillon, who was the first to pick up the trail left by castaways from the wrecked island vessels. On May 15, 1824, his ship, the St. Patrick, passed by Tikopia Island, one of the New Hebrides. There, a native boatman pulled alongside in a dugout canoe and sold Dillon a silver sword hilt bearing the imprint of characters engraved with a cutting tool known as a burin. Furthermore, this native boatman claimed that during a stay in Vanikoro 6 years earlier, he had seen two Europeans belonging to ships that had run aground on the island's reefs many years before. Dillon guessed that the ships at issue were those under the Count de la Pérouse, ships whose disappearance had shaken the entire world. He tried to reach Vanikoro where, according to the native boatman, a good deal of rubble from the shipwreck could still be found, but winds and currents prevented his doing so. Dillon returned to Calcutta. There he was able to interest the Asiatic Society and the East India Company in his discovery. A ship named after the search was placed at his disposal, and he departed on January 23, 1827, accompanied by a French deputy. This new search, after putting in at several stops over the Pacific, dropped anchor before Vanikoro on July 7, 1827, in the same harbor of Havana where the Nautilus was currently floating. There, Dillon collected many relics of the shipwreck: iron utensils, anchors, eyelets from pulleys, swivel guns, an 18-pound shell, the remains of some astronomical instruments, a piece of stern rail, and a bronze bell bearing the inscriptions made by Bazin, the foundry market Brest Arsenal around 1785. There could no longer be any doubt. Finishing his investigations, Dillon stayed at the site of the casualty until the month of October. Then he left Vanikoro, headed toward New Zealand, dropped anchor at Calcutta on April 7, 1828, and returned to France, where he received a very cordial welcome from King Charles X. But just then the renowned French explorer, Captain Dumont d'Urberville, unaware of Dillon's activities, had already set sail to search elsewhere for the site of the shipwreck. In essence, a whaling vessel had reported that some metals and a cross of St. Louis had been found in the hands of savages on the Louisiade Islands and New Caledonia. So Captain Dumont d'Urberville had put to sea in command of a vessel named after the astrolabe, and just 2 months after Dillon had left Vanikoro, Dumont d'Urberville dropped anchor before Hobart. There he heard about Dillon's findings, and he further learned that a certain James Hobbs, chief officer on the Union out of Calcutta, had put to shore in an island located in latitude 8 degrees 18 south and longitude 156 degrees 30 east, and noted the natives of these waterways making use of iron bars and red fabrics. Pretty perplexed, Dumont d'Urberville didn't know if he should give credence to these reports, which had been carried in some of the less reliable newspapers. Nevertheless, he decided to start on Dillon's trail. On February 10, 1828, the new astrolabe hove before Tikopia Island, took on a guide and interpreter in the person of a deserter who had settled there, plied a course toward Vanikoro, raised it on February 12th, sailed alongside its reefs until the 14th, and only on the 20th dropped anchor inside its barrier in the harbor of Havana. On the 23rd, several officers circled the island and brought back some rubble of little importance. The natives, adopting a system of denial and evasion, refused to guide them to the site of the casualty. This rather shady conduct aroused the suspicion that the natives had mistreated the castaways, and in truth the natives seemed afraid that Dumont d'Urberville had come to avenge the Count de la Pérouse and his unfortunate companions. But on the 26th, appeased with gifts and seeing that they didn't need to fear any reprisals, the natives led the chief officer, Mr. Jacquinot, to the site of the shipwreck. At this location, in 3 or 4 fathoms of water between the Peiu and Vana reefs, there lay some anchors, cannons, and ingots of iron and lead, all caked with limestone concretions. A launch and whaleboat from the new astrolabe were steered to this locality, and after going to exhausting lengths, their crews managed to dredge up an anchor weighing 1,800 pounds, a cast-iron 8-pounder cannon, a lead ingot, and 2 copper swivel guns. Questioning the natives, Captain Dumont d'Urberville also learned that after La Pérouse's 2 ships had miscarried on the island's reefs, the Count had built a smaller craft, only to go off and miscarry a second time. Where? Nobody knew. The commander of the new astrolabe then had a monument erected under a tuft of mangrove in memory of the famous navigator and his companions. It was a simple quadrangular pyramid set on a coral base with no ironwork to tempt the natives' avarice. Then Dumont d'Urberville tried to depart, but his crews were run down from the fevers raging on these unsanitary shores, and quite ill himself, he was unable to weigh anchor until March 17th. Meanwhile, fearing that Dumont d'Urberville wasn't abreast of Dillon's activities, the French government sent up a sloop of war to Vanikoro. The Bayonnaise, under Commander Legoant de Tromelin, who had been stationed on the American west coast, dropping anchor before Vanikoro a few months after the new astrolabe's departure, the Bayonnaise didn't find any additional evidence but verified that the savages hadn't disturbed the memorial honoring the Count de la Pérouse. This is the substance of the account I gave Captain Nemo. So, he said to me, the castaways built a third ship on Vanikoro Island, and to this day nobody knows where it went and perished. Nobody knows. Captain Nemo didn't reply, but signaled me to follow him to the main lounge. The Nautilus sank a few meters beneath the waves, and the panels opened. I rushed to the window and saw crusts of coral, fungus coral, Sophanula coral, Alcyon coral, sea anemone from the genus Caryophylla, plus myriads of charming fish, including greenfish, damselfish, sweepers, snappers, and squirrelfish. Underneath this coral covering, I detected some rubble the old dredges hadn't been able to tear free. Iron stirrups, anchors, cannons, shells, tackle from a capstan, a stem post, all objects hailing from the wrecked ships and now carpeted in moving flowers. And as I stared at this desolate wreckage, Captain Nemo told me in a solemn voice, Commander La Pérouse set out on December 7th, 1785, with his ships, the Compass and the Astrolabe. He dropped anchor first at Botany Bay, visited the Tonga Islands and New Caledonia, headed toward the Santa Cruz Islands, and put it at Nomoka, one of the reefs in the Hanape group. Then his ships arrived at the unknown reefs of Vanikoro. Traveling in the lead, the Compass ran afoul of breakers on the southerly coast. The Astrolabe went to its rescue and also ran aground. The first ship was destroyed almost immediately. The second, stranded to leeward, held up for some days. The natives gave the castaways a fair enough welcome. The latter took up residence on the island and built a smaller craft with rubble from the two large ones. A few seamen stayed voluntarily in Vanikoro. The others, weak and ailing, set sail with the Count de la Pérouse. They headed to the Solomon Islands, and they perished with all hands on the westerly coast of the chief island in that group, between Cape Deception and Cape Satisfaction. And how do you know all this? I exclaimed. Here's what I found at that very site of that final shipwreck. Captain Nemo showed me a tin box, stamped with the coat of arms of France and all corroded by salt water. He opened it, and I saw a bundle of papers, yellowed, but still legible. They were the actual military orders given by France's Minister of the Navy to Commander La Pérouse, with notes along the margin in the handwriting of King Louis XVI. Ah, what a splendid death for a seaman, Captain Nemo then said. A coral grave is a tranquil grave, and may heaven grant that my companions and I rest in no other. And that is where I shall leave you for this week, with this grim and solemn discovery. So I hope that you enjoyed tonight's reading as we make our way through 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. In the meantime, keep reading, keep wearing your fabulous sea hats, whales, crabs, clownfish, squid, whatever you like, a pirate hat, a captain hat, whatever nautical strikes your fancy. Go back on our YouTube channel, Washington County Free Library, watch all of our past episodes of Chapters, watch our OG original episodes, the ones that I animated, watch our other listen to our other Jules Verne novel, Around the World in 80 Days, and tune in 2 weeks. That will be Thursday, August the 18th at 7 p.m. here on YouTube. So have a good night, keep reading, and I will see you all in 2 weeks on Thursday, August 18th at 7 p.m. here on YouTube. Good night.